At my lavish Newport wedding, my future mother-in-law halted the family photo shoot to publicly humiliate my mother over her handmade dress, calling her a stain on a magazine perfect day. When I looked at my wealthy fiancé for support, he just laughed and agreed that my mother was an embarrassment. He had no idea that instead of saying, "I do," I was about to lock the venue doors, cancel the wedding, and mathematically destroy his family empire. My name is Vanessa. I am 33 years old, and I was minutes away from marrying into the Kensington family, a dynasty of luxury real estate developers. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to burn down a toxic relationship to protect the people you love. The air at the historic Newport, Rhode Island estate was thick with the scent of imported white roses and sea salt. It was a $500,000 wedding, meticulously curated to project absolute perfection to the elite guests already arriving on the sprawling manicured lawns. A string quartet played softly in the background, while waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated with crystal flutes of vintage champagne. I stood on the grand marble terrace in a custom silk gown, but my eyes were only on my mother Ruth. My mother was 60 years old and ran a modest neighborhood bakery. She had spent the last 3 months carefully restoring and tailoring a beautiful vintage lace dress for this exact day. It was not a designer label, but she looked elegant, radiant, and incredibly proud. She had sacrificed everything as a single mother to give me a good life, and seeing her smile as she took her place next to me for the formal family portraits filled my heart with overwhelming joy. That joy was violently ripped away less than a minute later. The photographer, a renowned artist hired from New York, was directing us into a classic symmetrical pose against the backdrop of the Atlantic Ocean. He asked my mother to step slightly forward to balance the frame. Before she could even move, my future mother-in-law, Caroline, stepped out of the formation. Caroline was draped in an obnoxious amount of diamonds and a couture gown that likely cost more than my mother earned in a year. "Stop the shoot right now," Caroline snapped. Her voice was sharp and loud, intentionally cutting through the gentle music. Several early arriving guests, including prominent politicians and wealthy socialites, turned their heads to watch. Caroline walked right up to my mother and looked her up and down with an expression of pure disgust. "I am not having this entire spread ruined," Caroline announced to the crowd. "Look at her. That dress looks like it was stitched together from old curtains. She is a complete stain on a magazine perfect day." A heavy, suffocated silence fell over the marble terrace. My mother froze, her cheeks flushing a deep, painful crimson. She instinctively crossed her arms over her chest as if trying to hide the lace she had worked so hard to perfect. I stepped forward, my blood turning to ice. "Caroline." I started, my voice trembling with shock. Caroline ignored me entirely and snapped her fingers at one of the burly event security guards standing nearby. "You there," she commanded. "Move this woman to the back row. Put her behind the tall floral arrangement so she is completely hidden from the camera. We cannot have people thinking the Kensingtons associate with this kind of poverty." The guard looked uncomfortable but took a step toward my mother. I immediately turned to my fiancé, Preston. We had been together for 2 years. He was 35, handsome, polished, and the heir to the Kensington real estate fortune. I looked into his eyes, desperately waiting for him to step up to defend the woman who raised me, to put his mother in her place. Instead, Preston looked at my mother, then looked at me, and let out a soft, amused chuckle. He leaned in close to my ear, his expensive cologne suddenly making me feel nauseous. "Come on, Vanessa," he whispered, his tone dripping with condescension. "My mother is right. Her poverty is embarrassing us in front of the board members. Just let them move her to the back so we can get a good picture and get this over with." He smiled, patted my waist, and stepped back into his pose, adjusting his custom lapel. In that fraction of a second, the illusion shattered. The man I loved vanished, replaced by a greedy, spineless stranger who viewed me and my family as nothing more than cheap props. My heart broke, but the tears I expected to cry never came. They evaporated, replaced by a cold, dangerous clarity that washed over my entire being. I did not belong in this family, and they were about to regret letting me in. I reached out and firmly grabbed my mother by the hand. "Come on, Mom," I said, my voice steady. "We are leaving right now." I turned my back on Preston, his mother, and the blinding flashes of the event photographer. I guided my mother down the marble steps and across the manicured lawn toward the massive mahogany doors of the estate. The heavy silk of my custom gown dragged against the grass, but I did not care. All I wanted was to get the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise me away from these toxic people. But we did not make it to the valet station. As we reached the arched entryway, two figures stepped deliberately out from the shadows, physically blocking the exit. It was Preston's younger sister Brittany and her husband Jamal. Jamal was the chief legal officer for the Kensington real estate empire. He was a tall, heavily built African-American man wearing a custom-tailored Tom Ford suit that likely cost more than the monthly rent for my mother's bakery. He stood with his arms firmly crossed over his chest, a smug, arrogant smirk plastered across his perfectly groomed face. Brittany clung tightly to his arm, sipping casually from a crystal champagne flute. She looked at my mother and me as if we were stray dogs that had somehow wandered onto her property. "Going somewhere so soon?" Jamal asked, his voice dripping with fake concern. "The party is just getting started, Vanessa. You cannot walk out on your own wedding. Move out of the way, Jamal," I demanded, keeping my grip on my mother's hand tight. Jamal chuckled, a deep, resonant sound that made my skin crawl. He uncrossed his arms and took a step forward, using his physical size to try and intimidate me. He looked down his nose at me, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of bullying someone he deemed socially inferior. He thrived on using his corporate lawyer persona to crush people outside the courtroom. "Now let us think about this rationally, Vanessa," Jamal said, adopting the patronizing tone he usually reserved for hostile witnesses. "You are highly emotional right now. I get it. But if you walk out those doors, you are breaching a verbal contract to participate in this ceremony. More importantly, you are throwing away the best thing that has ever happened to your pathetic life." I stared at him in utter disbelief. He was treating my wedding day like a corporate merger gone wrong. "Do not be stupid," Brittany chimed in, swirling her expensive champagne. "My mother was just telling the truth. Your mother looks absolutely ridiculous in that homemade rag. You should be thanking Caroline for not having security throw her out into the street." Jamal raised a hand, silencing his wife, so he could deliver what he thought was the final blow. He leaned in close, invading my personal space. "Let me remind you of a little legal document we executed last month, Vanessa. The prenuptial agreement. I drafted it myself. It is entirely ironclad. You get absolutely nothing if you do not make it down that aisle today. No alimony, no settlement, nothing." I looked at him, keeping my expression completely unreadable. He immediately mistook my stony silence for fear. "You are just a low-level office worker, Vanessa." Jamal sneered, his voice intentionally loud enough for the gathering crowd of Kensingtons to hear clearly. "You make what, 60,000 a year on a good day. You should be kissing the very ground this family walks on. Preston is offering you a life of luxury you could not even dream of in your wildest fantasies. Do not let your mother and her trailer park ego ruin your one and only meal ticket." A chorus of cruel, mocking snickers erupted behind me. I glanced over my shoulder. Preston, Caroline, Richard, and a dozen other wealthy Kensington relatives had gathered on the terrace to watch the show. They were all laughing. They genuinely thought they had me perfectly trapped. They believed that because I came from a working-class background, I would happily swallow my pride and beg for their scraps. My mother squeezed my hand, her eyes now overflowing with tears. "Vanessa, please," she whispered, her voice breaking with shame. "Just go ahead with the wedding. Do not ruin your bright future because of me. I will go wait in the car. I promise." Hearing the sheer defeat and humiliation in my mother's voice was the ultimate catalyst. It was the exact spark that ignited the massive powder keg inside my chest. For 2 long years I had played the part of the quiet, unassuming girlfriend. I had smiled politely through their constant condescending remarks. I had tolerated their endless financial microaggressions. I had let them believe they were the untouchable apex predators. But Jamal was dead wrong about one very crucial thing. I was not a low-level office worker clinging to a meal ticket, and I was certainly not trapped by his amateur legal drafting. I let go of my mother's hand and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "You are not going anywhere, Mom," I said softly, my voice laced with steel. "And neither are they." I stopped pushing toward the exit. The time for running away in tears was officially over. If they wanted a public spectacle, I was going to give them a financial bloodbath they would never forget. I turned around to face the smirking crowd of elites. I lifted my custom-arranged bridal bouquet of imported white roses. With deliberate chilling precision, I dropped it. The heavy flowers hit the stone patio with a soft thud, scattering petals across the ground. Without another word to Jamal or his snickering wife, I walked directly toward the main stage. I climbed the 3 velvet-lined steps onto the raised platform that had been erected for the wedding toasts. The string quartet was still playing a soft, elegant classical piece, completely oblivious to the hurricane that was about to rip through this venue. Hundreds of the most influential people in Rhode Island were scattered across the lawn and the grand ballroom, holding their crystal glasses, waiting for the ceremony to begin. They expected a docile bride. They expected a seamless merger of social capital. I walked directly to the center of the stage and wrapped my hand tightly around the silver microphone. I did not ask for their attention. I demanded it. I tapped the heavy metal head of the microphone with my index finger twice. A sharp, ear-piercing screech of audio feedback blasted through the towering speakers, instantly drowning out the string quartet. The musicians jolted in their seats, their bows freezing over their instruments. The arrogant laughter from the terrace died immediately. Every single head in the $500,000 venue snapped toward the stage. Elite politicians, wealthy investors, and snobbish socialites stared at me in stunned silence. I looked past all of them. My eyes found the broad, imposing figure of the event security captain standing near the main entrance. He was a former military contractor, a man who valued efficiency and cold hard cash above all else. At 8 o'clock this morning, while Preston was nursing a hangover from his bachelor party, I had wired exactly triple this captain's daily rate into his personal offshore account. I had purchased his absolute loyalty for the next 2 hours. I gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. He did not hesitate. He raised 2 fingers in the air, signaling the dozen burly security guards stationed around the perimeter. What happened next was a masterclass in synchronized execution. The guards stepped away from their decorative posts and moved directly to the grand mahogany doors, the side terrace exits, and the wrought iron gates at the edge of the property. Clack, clack, clack. The heavy metallic clicks of the brass deadbolts engaging echoed ominously through the silent ballroom. It was a sound that did not belong at a luxury wedding. It was the sound of a vault locking shut. A wave of sudden, palpable panic rippled through the crowd. The guests exchanged bewildered glances. I saw Jamal drop his arrogant posture, his legal mind suddenly trying to calculate what protocol was being broken. Brittany lowered her champagne glass, looking around like a frightened child. Down on the lawn, Caroline grabbed her husband Richard by the arm, her diamond rings flashing in the sunlight as she pointed frantically toward the locked gates. "What are you doing?" Caroline shrieked, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of its usual aristocratic polish. "Open those doors right now." I lifted the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the massive speakers, calm, steady, and utterly terrifying. "No one from the Kensington family is permitted to leave," I announced. The acoustics of the ballroom amplified my words, sending a chill through the warm summer air. The guests gasped. A few of the board members for Kensington Real Estate reached for their phones, sensing a massive public relations disaster. My mother stood safely near the edge of the stage, watching me with wide, astonished eyes, as the daughter she raised transformed into a force of nature. Please do not panic. I continued addressing the rest of the guests while keeping my eyes locked on the wealthy family that had just humiliated us. To our esteemed guests, the catering staff will continue serving champagne. You are welcome to stay and watch, but the Kensington family will remain exactly where they are. Jamal stepped forward, his face twisting with rage. "Are you insane, Vanessa?" he bellowed from the floor. "This is false imprisonment. I will have you arrested before you can even take off that cheap dress." I ignored the lawyer completely. My gaze shifted to Preston, who was staring up at me from the center aisle. The smug, condescending smile he had worn just 5 minutes ago had completely vanished. "The wedding is officially cancelled," I declared, my voice slicing through the rising murmurs of the crowd like a freshly sharpened blade. "But please take your seats, because the funeral for your empire begins right now." For a split second, absolute silence returned to the estate. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that precedes a devastating explosion. Then the reality of my words hit them. Preston finally snapped. His face flushed a dark, violent shade of red. He threw his crystal glass onto the stone floor, shattering it into 100 pieces, and stormed aggressively toward the stage. "Cut the mic!" Preston screamed at the audio technicians, his veins bulging against the collar of his custom tuxedo. "Cut the damn mic right now, or I will fire every single one of you." Preston lunged up the velvet stairs, his polished shoes slipping slightly on the carpet in his blind rage. He crossed the stage in 3 massive strides and grabbed my upper arm. His fingers dug painfully into my skin through the delicate silk of my wedding dress. He leaned his face inches from mine, his breath hot and smelling of expensive whiskey and panic. The microphone in my hand was still live, amplifying his heavy breathing through the towering speakers for all the elite guests to hear. "Do not do this," he hissed, his voice a lethal whisper that the entire ballroom could still catch. "You are making a massive mistake, Vanessa. Tell the guards to open the doors right now, or I swear I will completely destroy your pathetic little life." I did not pull away. I stood perfectly still and let him expose exactly who he was to the crowd. "Oh, you are going to destroy my life?" I asked calmly into the microphone. Preston tightened his grip, a cruel, mocking sneer twisting his handsome features. "Do not play games with me," he spat. "You are a nobody. You have a mediocre $60,000 a year administrative job. You file paperwork and get coffee. If you humiliate my family today, I will make a few phone calls. My father and I have connections in every major corporation on the East Coast. We will blacklist you. I will make sure you are utterly unemployable in every single state in America. You will be back to scrubbing floors or baking cheap muffins with your mother by tomorrow morning." A collective gasp echoed from the audience. A few prominent investors in the front row exchanged uncomfortable looks. Preston was blinded by arrogance, not realizing he was publicly assassinating his own character. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. My expression remained blank. Then I looked back up into his furious eyes. "Take your hand off me," I commanded. My voice was not loud, but it carried an undeniable authority that made him hesitate. Before he could react, I reached over with my free hand, dug my thumb into the pressure point on his wrist, and forcefully pried his fingers off my arm. He stumbled back, genuinely shocked. He was so used to women cowering before his family name that he did not know how to compute defiance. I adjusted my silk sleeve and brought the microphone back to my mouth. "You are right about one thing, Preston," I said, my voice echoing through the massive ballroom. "I do file paperwork. But you were profoundly wrong about the kind of paperwork I handle. For the last 2 years, I let you believe I was just a struggling office worker. I let you buy my dinner. I let you buy me cheap gifts while you bought yourself Rolexes. I let you and your family treat me like a charity case because I needed to know exactly who you were behind the designer suits and the society pages. And more importantly, I needed to review your corporate ledgers." Preston furrowed his brow, his anger momentarily replaced by genuine confusion. "Corporate ledgers?" he repeated blankly. I turned slightly and gestured toward the massive LED screen behind the altar. It was a state-of-the-art display originally set up to play a romantic video montage of our relationship during the reception. I had given the audio-visual technicians a very different flash drive this morning. I am not an administrative assistant, Preston, I announced. And I certainly do not make $60,000 a year. My name is Vanessa, and I am the Senior Director of Mergers, Acquisitions, and Distressed Assets at Vanguard Capital. A massive shockwave tore through the room. Vanguard Capital was known as one of the most ruthless private equity firms on Wall Street. They were corporate sharks famous for swallowing failing companies whole. I pressed a remote hidden in my hand. The LED screen behind me flared to life, illuminating the dim ballroom with a bright blue glow. It did not show photos of us on the beach. Instead, it displayed my official corporate profile. The Vanguard Capital logo sat proudly at the top, followed by my name, my executive title, and a brief summary of my recent billion-dollar acquisitions. At the bottom, bold white text highlighted my estimated personal net worth, a figure that easily dwarfed the entire Kensington Trust. The arrogant smirks on the faces of Caroline, Richard, Jamal, and Brittany instantly froze, replaced by a cold, suffocating terror. Carolyn was the first to break the heavy silence. She stepped forward, waving her manicured hand in the air as if she could physically bat away the damning information glowing on the massive screen. "Oh, please," Caroline laughed, her voice shrill and trembling with desperate denial. "This is just a tasteless prank. Preston, did your groomsmen put her up to this? Or perhaps this is some pathetic revenge fantasy because I asked her mother to step aside. Everyone, please go back to your champagne. This silly girl is clearly having a mental breakdown." She looked around the ballroom, flashing a wide, terrifyingly rigid smile, praying the elite crowd would buy her completely fabricated narrative. But nobody was laughing, and nobody was moving, least of all her husband, Richard. As the chief executive officer of Kensington Real Estate, Richard knew exactly what Vanguard Capital was. He recognized the aggressive corporate branding, the specific formatting of the executive profile, and the undeniable reality of the financial numbers displayed before him. All the blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He grabbed Caroline by the arm, his fingers sinking deeply into her couture fabric, pulling her back. "Shut up, Caroline," Richard hissed, his voice cracking with genuine panic. "Just shut up right now and look at the logo on that screen. This is real." I stepped closer to the edge of the stage, my eyes locked on Preston. He looked like he had just been struck by a speeding freight train, his mouth hanging open in silent disbelief. "I wanted to know if you loved me for who I was." "Preston," I said, making sure every single word echoed clearly through the vast ballroom. "In my high-stakes world, men only see the Vanguard title. They only see the executive bonuses, the stock options, and the massive net worth. When we met, I stripped all of that away. I rented a small apartment, drove an old car, and introduced myself as a low-level administrator. I gave you a complete blank slate. I gave you the chance to love me, Vanessa, the woman with absolutely nothing to her name." I paused, letting the heavy weight of my words settle over him and his stunned family. But life has a very sharp sense of humor. 6 months into our relationship, the senior partners at my firm handed me a highly classified new portfolio of distressed assets to investigate for a potential hostile acquisition. The target company on the very first page of that dossier was Kensington Real Estate. Richard let out a strangled gasp, stumbling backward, until his waist hit the edge of a decorated dining table. The elite investors, politicians, and socialites in the crowd immediately started whispering, shifting physically away from the Kensington family, as if their sudden financial ruin were a highly contagious disease. For the last 18 months, I have had full, unrestricted access to every single dark corner of your corporate finances. I continued pacing slowly and deliberately across the stage. "I know all about the hidden liabilities you buried in offshore shell companies. I know about the heavily over-leveraged commercial properties in downtown Boston that are currently hemorrhaging cash. I know that the luxury residential condos you are supposedly building in the financial district are sitting abandoned because you simply cannot afford to pay the private contractors. I stopped pacing and looked directly at Caroline, who was now openly hyperventilating, clutching her diamond necklace as if it could somehow save her from drowning in her own lies. Your incredible wealth is a complete facade, Caroline. The designer gowns, the exclusive country club memberships, the leased luxury cars, and this very $500,000 wedding event. It is all built on a massive, unstable mountain of toxic debt. You are not American royalty like you pretend to be. You are completely and utterly broke. Preston shook his head violently, refusing to accept his crushing new reality. You are lying, he yelled, his voice echoing frantically across the silent room. My father is a financial genius. Kensington real estate is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You cannot just stand up there in front of our friends and make these insane, baseless accusations. I looked down at him with absolute pity, watching the entitled boy shatter. I am not making accusations, Preston. I am presenting the math. I raised the small black remote in my hand and clicked the button one more time. The screen behind me instantly shifted. The Vanguard executive profile vanished, replaced immediately by a scanned copy of a massive, heavily redacted legal document. The bold, black letters at the top read, Chapter 11, Corporate Bankruptcy Filing. And right at the bottom of the glowing screen, crystal clear for every investor, banker, and society reporter in the room to see, were Richard's desperate forged signatures. A collective deafening gasp erupted from the hundreds of high society guests packed into the grand ballroom. The silence that had gripped the room seconds ago shattered completely. Smartphones were immediately pulled from designer clutch purses and tuxedo pockets. The distinct sound of camera shutters clicked rapidly as prominent investors, political figures, and socialites scrambled to capture photographic evidence of the glowing Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing before it disappeared. The facade of the Kensington dynasty was disintegrating live in front of their wealthiest peers. Richard finally snapped out of his catatonic shock. The sight of his own forged signatures displayed on a 20-foot screen sent him into an absolute frenzy. He shoved past Caroline, nearly knocking over a towering arrangement of imported white orchids, and marched toward the edge of the stage. His face was a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. "Turn that screen off right now!" Richard bellowed, his voice echoing violently through the room. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "You arrogant little fraud! You think you can just walk in here and ruin my company? Those documents are highly classified. They are protected by strict federal bank confidentiality laws." I stood my ground, gripping the microphone, watching the patriarch of this supposed empire lose his mind. "You have crossed a massive legal line, Vanessa!" Richard screamed, spit flying from his lips as he desperately tried to regain control of the narrative. "I am going to sue you for everything you are worth. I am going to bury you and your firm in federal court for corporate espionage. You hacked into our private banking servers. You stole confidential financial data. You are going to federal prison for this." Preston stood frozen in the center aisle, looking back and forth between his raging father and the damning screen. Caroline was weeping loudly, clutching her diamond necklace. I let Richard scream until he ran out of breath. I let him look as unhinged and guilty as possible in front of the very investors he had been lying to for years. When his frantic shouts finally died down, leaving only the sound of his heavy, panicked breathing, I raised the microphone back to my lips. My smile was lethal cold and perfectly controlled. "I did not hack into anything, Richard," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I am a senior director at Vanguard Capital. We do not need to steal financial information like petty thieves. We let the banks bring it directly to us on a silver platter." Richard blinked, his expression twisting into a mix of confusion and rising dread. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to the edge of the stage, towering over him. "The banks you owe money to are not stupid, Richard. They have known for months that Kensington real estate is a sinking ship. They knew your commercial properties were empty. They knew your luxury condos were stalled. And they knew you had absolutely no liquidity left to make your upcoming quarterly payments. You were a massive bleeding liability on their balance sheets. The murmurs in the ballroom grew louder. Several board members standing near the back began edging toward the locked doors, realizing the immense legal fallout that was about to hit. So instead of waiting for you to inevitably default and drag them down into a messy public bankruptcy court, your lenders quietly shopped your debt around Wall Street, I explained, making sure to articulate every single financial term so the investors in the room understood the sheer scale of his failure. They were desperate to offload the radioactive mess you created. And that is exactly where Vanguard Capital stepped in. Richard gripped the edge of the stage, his knuckles turning stark white. "You cannot do that," he whispered hoarsely. "We absolutely can," I replied smoothly. "Exactly 24 hours ago, while your son was out drinking at his bachelor party, bragging about his trust fund, I was sitting in a boardroom in Manhattan. I personally drafted and executed the final contracts. Vanguard Capital bought the entirety of Kensington Real Estate's toxic debt, all $45 million of it. And because you are considered an incredibly high-risk failing enterprise, we bought your debt for pennies on the dollar." The room spun into absolute chaos. The sheer magnitude of the financial takeover was incomprehensible to the people who had spent decades kissing Richard's ring. He did not own his company anymore. He did not own his luxury cars. He did not own the sprawling mansions he used to secure those massive fraudulent loans. I looked directly into Richard's wide, terrified eyes, delivering the final fatal blow to his ego. "I am no longer your future daughter-in-law, Richard," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute crushing authority. "I am your sole creditor." Richard stared at me, his jaw trembling as the reality of my words finally penetrated his massive ego. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for gravity to take over. You could hear a pin drop in that massive ballroom, save for the frantic whispering of the elite investors, who were already mentally calculating how much money they were about to lose by associating with the Kensington name. They were ruthless people, and they recognized a financial bloodbath when they saw one. "Let me explain exactly what it means to be your sole creditor." Richard V. continued, my voice calm, but laced with absolute poison. "It means I no longer just have a front row seat to your financial circus. I own the tent, I own the tickets, and I own the clowns." At exactly 8 o'clock this morning, while you were drinking your morning espresso and yelling at your landscaping staff to ensure the lawns were perfectly manicured for the sham of a wedding, I sat at my mahogany desk in Manhattan. I opened your heavily breached loan agreements, and I invoked the immediate restructuring clauses embedded deep within the fine print. Richard tried to speak, but only a pathetic, choked sound escaped his throat. "You see, when a private equity firm like Vanguard Capital buys distressed debt, we do not politely wait for you to pay us back. We take the steering wheel immediately," I explained, making sure every syllable rang crystal clear through the speakers. "My first official act was to contact your primary financial institutions. As of 8:01 this morning, every single corporate credit line attached to Kensington Real Estate was permanently frozen. The money you used to pay your contractors, your vendors, and your massive legal team is entirely gone. The accounts are locked down. You cannot move a single dollar without my express written permission." A few gasps erupted from the vendors standing near the kitchen doors. The catering manager suddenly looked very pale. "My second act was to make a few calls to the site managers of your so-called luxury condo developments in the financial district," I stated. "I ordered an immediate halt to all construction. The cranes are locked in place. The gates are chained shut. The workers have been sent home indefinitely. Your entire operating pipeline is dead." But I did not stop there, I said, shifting my icy gaze from Richard to his hyperventilating wife. I wanted to make sure the consequences were felt closer to home. "Caroline, that stunning diamond necklace you are wearing right now, the couture gown, the private jet memberships you constantly boast about at your exclusive country club luncheons. All of it is funded through the Kensington corporate accounts as executive expense write-offs, which means, legally speaking, you are wearing my money. You are standing in my venue." Caroline took a shaky step backward, her hand flying up to desperately clutch the diamonds at her throat as if I were going to rip them off her neck right then and there. "And your corporate fleet," I added smoothly, watching the horror wash over her face. "Those 6 leased luxury vehicles your family drives around Newport to look important and wealthy. The recovery agents were dispatched at 9 this morning. They are currently towing your Maybach and your 2 Range Rovers out of the country club parking lot as we speak. You do not own anything anymore. Not the cars, not the company, and certainly not the social status you wield like a weapon against people like my mother." Preston, who had been standing frozen in the aisle, suddenly snapped back to life. His perfectly styled hair was now disheveled, and sweat was beading heavily on his forehead. "You cannot do this, Vanessa," he shouted, his voice cracking in a high-pitched panic. "You are bluffing. There is no way you pulled this off without our bankers notifying us immediately. I am calling the bank right now. They will shut this entire stunt down." Preston frantically dug into the pocket of his custom-tailored tuxedo and pulled out his sleek new smartphone. His hands were shaking so violently he almost dropped the device on the stone floor. He swiped rapidly at the screen, his eyes wide and desperate, acting like a spoiled child who firmly believed his father's money could magically fix the massive hurricane tearing through his life. Everyone in the ballroom watched him. He put the phone to his ear, pacing in a tight, frantic circle. "Come on, pick up the phone," he muttered under his breath, his arrogance completely replaced by raw terror. But his expression rapidly shifted from anger to sheer, unadulterated horror. He pulled the phone away from his ear and stared at the dark screen. I tilted my head, raising the microphone one last time. "Are you having trouble getting through, Preston?" I asked sweetly. Caroline gasped for air, clutching her pearls as her knees visibly buckled beneath her. Preston looked up at me, his face completely devoid of color, as he desperately tried to call his bankers again, only to find that his cell phone service had already been disconnected for non-payment. Preston stood frozen with the dead phone in his hand, looking like a man who had just realized the parachute he jumped with was completely empty. Caroline was practically sobbing into Richard's shoulder, and the sheer panic radiating from the Kensington family was palpable. But in every pack of predators, when the alpha is wounded, another will always step up to try and claim dominance. That was Jamal. He could not stand watching the empire that funded his extravagant lifestyle crumble in a matter of minutes. More importantly, his massive ego as a high-powered corporate lawyer simply could not allow a woman to outsmart him in front of Rhode Island's elite. Jamal abruptly let go of his wife Brittany's arm. He adjusted the lapels of his custom Tom Ford suit, puffed out his chest, and marched toward the stage with the aggressive, measured strides of a man entering a courtroom he believed he owned. He viewed himself as the ultimate apex predator of the legal world, a man who could twist the law to crush anyone who dared defy his family's interests. The crowd parted for him, murmurs rippling through the guests, as the chief legal officer of Kensington Real Estate prepared to launch his counterattack. "Do not listen to another word this woman says," Jamal barked, his deep voice easily carrying across the massive ballroom without the need for a microphone. He stopped at the bottom of the velvet stairs, looking up at me with absolute contempt. "Everyone take a deep breath. This entire spectacle is nothing but smoke and mirrors." He turned slightly to address the panicked investors and socialites. "As the chief legal officer of this corporation, I can assure you that our assets are fully protected. What you are witnessing right now is a desperate, highly illegal stunt pulled by an emotional woman who is upset about a seating arrangement at a wedding." Jamal turned his fierce glare back to me. "You think you are the smartest person in the room, Vanessa? You think you can just wave a Vanguard Capital title around and scare us into submission? But you made one massive fatal miscalculation today. You forgot who drafted the corporate bylaws for this company. You forgot who you are dealing with." He began pacing at the base of the stage, ticking off points on his fingers, like he was delivering a closing argument to a jury. "Let us talk about the law," he said, his tone dripping with patronizing arrogance. "What you just admitted to doing here today constitutes textbook extortion. You are attempting to use highly confidential proprietary financial information to publicly coerce and humiliate this family. That alone is a federal offense. He pointed his finger sharply at me. But it gets much worse for you. By bypassing standard banking notification protocols and executing an unannounced hostile freeze on our accounts, you have committed blatant wire fraud. Furthermore, your little stunt violates about a dozen Securities and Exchange Commission regulations regarding breach of fiduciary duty and corporate espionage. You did not buy our debt legally. You weaponized inside information gained under the false pretenses of a romantic relationship. Jamal stopped pacing and crossed his arms over his broad chest, looking incredibly pleased with himself. I am going to make it my personal mission to destroy you, he threatened, his voice dropping to a dangerous icy register. By Monday morning, I will have an emergency injunction filed in federal court reversing every single one of your restructuring clauses. Then I am going to contact the regulatory boards. I will have you permanently disbarred from the financial sector. I will have your executive licenses revoked. And before the ink is even dry on your termination papers, I will have the FBI knocking on your door to escort you to a federal penitentiary. He looked over his shoulder at his father-in-law. Richard, relax, Jamal commanded with absolute authority. Preston, put that useless phone away. Caroline, stop crying. We are the Kensingtons. We do not get bullied by mid-level private equity vultures. I have ironclad defenses ready to go, and I will personally see to it that Vanessa spends the next 10 years of her life behind bars for this little theatrical performance. A wave of relief visibly washed over the Kensington side of the ballroom. The elite guests, many of whom had faced their own legal battles, respected the sheer aggression of his counterattack. Brittany looked at her husband with sheer adoration, her confidence restored. Richard stood up a little straighter, his chest inflating as he believed his brilliant son-in-law had just saved the family empire from complete annihilation. I stood perfectly still on the stage, the microphone resting gently in my hand. I did not interrupt him. I did not try to shout over him or defend my legal standing. I simply let him dig his own grave with a silver shovel. I waited for the echoes of his grandstanding to fade completely into the tense silence of the room. When I was absolutely certain he was finished, I offered him a cold, predatory smile. I reached into the hidden pocket of my silk gown and pulled out a second, much thinner file. I was hoping you would speak up, Jamal, I said. I opened the thin manila folder and let my eyes scan the top page before looking back down at the furious lawyer standing at the base of the stage. You throw around terms like extortion and wire fraud with a lot of confidence for a man who clearly has not updated his legal knowledge since his first year of law school. I began, my voice perfectly steady. The investors in the room were dead silent. Some of the most prominent corporate attorneys in Rhode Island were standing in that crowd, and I made sure to pitch my voice so every single one of them could hear the absolute dismantling of Jamal's professional reputation. Let us talk about those ironclad defenses you just bragged about, Jamal. I flipped to the second page. Do you remember the massive mezzanine loan you negotiated with Harbor Trust Bank 2 years ago? The one that was supposed to save your luxury condo project. You drafted the master agreement yourself, didn't you? Jamal kept his arms crossed, his jaw set tightly. I am not discussing privileged corporate contracts with a hostile party, he spat out, though his voice lacked the booming authority it carried just moments before. He shifted his weight nervously. You do not have to discuss it because I am holding the final executed copy right here, I replied, holding up the document. And any first-year associate could tell you that on page 47 under section 9.4, you completely forgot to include a standard change of control provision. You also failed to draft a basic notification clause regarding the assignment of debt. Do you know what that means in plain English, Jamal? I did not wait for him to answer. It means Harbor Trust Bank was legally permitted to sell your debt to Vanguard Capital or to anyone else on the planet without giving you a single day of prior notice. Your sloppy drafting handed them the keys to your kingdom. There was no corporate espionage. There was no wire fraud. There was just a ruthless private equity firm capitalizing on the glaring loopholes left behind by a hopelessly incompetent chief legal officer. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Several of the actual corporate lawyers in the audience began shaking their heads, whispering to each other in disbelief. Forgetting a change of control provision on a multi-million-dollar commercial loan was professional suicide. It was the kind of amateur mistake that got people fired on the spot. But Richard did not fire you, did he? I pressed, taking a deliberate step toward him. Because you did not earn your position through merit. You did not claw your way up the corporate ladder by being the sharpest legal mind in the room. You got your title by putting a ring on his daughter. You are a nepotism hire masquerading as an alpha male. You spend your days playing golf at the exclusive country club and billing the company for expensive lunches while actual legal sharks circle your sinking ship. Jamal's face flushed a deep, humiliating purple. The confident swagger had entirely evaporated, replaced by the frantic, panicked energy of a cornered animal. He opened his mouth to shout a rebuttal, but the words caught in his throat. He looked back at his father-in-law, hoping for support, but Richard was glaring at him with pure, unadulterated hatred. Richard finally understood that the son-in-law he trusted to protect his massive assets had instead left the front door wide open for the slaughter. "You want to know how Vanguard Capital bought your company right under your nose?" I asked, leaning slightly over the edge of the stage. "We simply read the public SEC filings that you were supposed to monitor. While you were busy threatening me with your pathetic prenuptial agreement, my team of corporate attorneys was legally acquiring the deeds to every single property your family claims to own. You missed the hostile takeover because you were too busy looking down on people like my mother to realize the floor was giving out beneath you." "Shut up!" Jamal finally yelled, his composure completely shattering as the reality of his massive failure set in. "You are spinning technicalities to confuse everyone. You are still going to federal prison." I closed the file and tapped it gently against the microphone stand. I looked past him to where Brittany was standing, her pale face streaked with ruined makeup. "I am not the one going to prison, Jamal," I said, dropping the temperature of my voice to a freezing calm. "You see, being a terrible lawyer is highly embarrassing. Drafting contracts full of loopholes is a fireable offense. It makes you a joke to every professional in this room." I paused, making sure every eye in the ballroom was locked on his sweating face. "But incompetence isn't a crime, Jamal," I said. "What you and Brittany have been doing in the Cayman Islands, however, absolutely is." I pressed the button on my remote one more time. The massive LED screen behind me instantly shifted from the botched Harbor Trust loan agreement to a series of heavily redacted, highly confidential banking statements. The logo at the top left corner belonged to an offshore institution based in the Cayman Islands. A collective low murmur rolled through the grand ballroom. Every seasoned investor in the room instantly recognized the signature layout of an offshore tax haven account. Jamal lunged forward, slipping against the bottom step of the stage. He looked completely unhinged. "Turn that off right now!" he roared, his voice cracking with panic. "You have no legal right to display those documents. That is private property, and you obtained it illegally." I took a measured step back, keeping my distance from his desperate flailing, and calmly raised the heavy silver microphone back to my lips. "When a private equity firm buys out your corporate debt, Jamal, we gain full legal access to the results of any forensic audits we commission. Our forensic accountants found your little offshore side project absolutely fascinating." I turned to look at the screen, using my free hand to point at the glowing columns of numbers. "Let us walk your friends and colleagues through your brilliant legal strategy, shall we?" Over the past 18 months, while Kensington Real Estate was desperately defaulting on its commercial loans and laying off hundreds of hard-working construction crews, you and your wife were remarkably busy. I pointed to a detailed financial flow chart that now appeared next to the bank statements. As the chief legal officer of this corporation, Jamal had the ultimate authority to approve outside vendor contracts and external legal consultations without ever triggering a secondary review from the finance department. He used that unchecked absolute power to create a complex, tangled web of 7 different shell companies securely registered in Delaware. He drafted the fake vendor contracts himself. He approved the exorbitant legal invoices himself. And because his lovely wife Brittany sits on the internal corporate audit committee as a nepotism appointment, she happily stamped her signature on every single quarterly financial review. She ensured that no red flags were ever raised to the board of directors. Brittany let out a sharp, terrified gasp. She covered her mouth with both trembling hands, her eyes wide with absolute horror as the elite guests surrounding her began to physically back away. She was no longer a wealthy, untouchable socialite. She was a criminal accomplice, being exposed in real time. Richard stared at his daughter and his son-in-law, his chest heaving heavily. He had been completely blind. He was so intensely focused on projecting a flawless image of billionaire success to the world that he let his own family gut his company from the inside out. "You funneled the cash out in perfectly calculated increments," I explained, keeping my tone clinical, precise, and utterly relentless. $50,000 here for a bogus environmental impact study, $80,000 there for phantom legal retainers that never existed. All of it was cleanly washed through the Delaware shell companies before being quietly wired directly into your pristine, untouchable Cayman Islands bank account. You essentially used your father-in-law's failing company as your own personal automated teller machine to fund your private jets and designer wardrobes. Jamal was sweating profusely now. His custom-tailored suit clung awkwardly to his back. He looked frantically around the room, desperate to find a single friendly face. But the high society crowd was looking at him with absolute, unfiltered disgust. Stealing money was one thing, but getting caught so sloppily was the ultimate sin in their exclusive world. "You cannot prove any of this in a court of law," Jamal stammered, pointing a violently shaking finger at me. "Those documents are entirely circumstantial. We have completely legitimate business interests offshore." "Legitimate business interests," I repeated slowly, allowing a dry, humorless laugh to escape my lips. I clicked the remote one final time. A new document filled the giant screen. It was an internal corporate transfer ledger, completely unredacted, showing the exact origin of the stolen funds before they ever hit the Delaware shell companies. I did not just track where the money went, Jamal. I tracked exactly where it came from. The ballroom fell into a deathly, suffocating silence as the guests read the name of the originating account on the massive screen. Richard let out a guttural sound of pure agony. Caroline dropped to her knees on the stone patio. "You did not just steal from corporate revenue," I stated, my voice echoing like thunder. "You stole from the Kensington Foundation. The money sitting in your offshore account was explicitly donated by the generous people standing in this very room to build housing for underprivileged youth." The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. In the ultra-wealthy circles of American high society, there is an unspoken code of conduct. You can be ruthless in business. You can lay off thousands of employees without losing a wink of sleep. You can even lie to your own family. But you never ever steal from a registered charitable foundation. Stealing from a charity is not just a severe federal crime that guarantees prison time. It is ultimate social suicide. It means you are stealing directly from the tax-deductible contributions of your very own peers. I watched the color drain from the faces of the most powerful people in Rhode Island. A prominent state senator standing near the ice sculpture slammed his crystal glass onto a table, his face flushed with genuine fury. A tech billionaire in the front row who I knew had personally written a $200,000 check to the Kensington Foundation last winter pointed a shaking finger at Jamal. $3 million, I announced, letting the staggering figure hang heavily in the air. "That is the exact amount you two managed to siphon out of the Youth Foundation over the last 18 months. $3 million meant for after-school programs, community centers, and affordable housing." I pressed the button on the remote again. The screen shifted to a categorized expense report directly linked to their Cayman Islands account. "Let us see exactly where the charity money went," I offered coldly. The guests leaned in their outrage, fueling their morbid curiosity. "It looks like $400,000 went directly to a private aviation company to fund your exclusive jet memberships," I read aloud, pointing to the glowing red numbers. Because flying commercial is simply too pedestrian when you are running a charity scam. Another 600,000 went toward Brittany's personal shopping sprees in Paris and Milan. Those custom couture dresses and limited edition handbags she loves to flaunt at country club luncheons were paid for by money meant to house homeless children. And let us not forget the $1.2 million spent on luxury vacations to St. Bart's, the Maldives, and Monaco. Brittany began to sob uncontrollably. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the crowd began to verbally turn on her. Shouts of disgust and absolute betrayal echoed from the guests. Several prominent socialites who had previously smiled and kissed Brittany on the cheek were now openly calling her a thief and a disgrace. Jamal frantically backed away from his wife, realizing the mob was closing in. He raised his hands defensively. "This is fabricated," he yelled over the rising noise of the angry crowd. "This woman is doctoring financial records to ruin us. It is a deep fake." Nobody believed him. The evidence was far too granular, far too precise, and it perfectly explained how a mid-level corporate lawyer and a nepotism hire were suddenly living like literal billionaires while their parent company was bleeding cash. But the most violent reaction did not come from the betrayed donors. It came from the very people who had raised Brittany. I watched Richard Kensington process the math in real time. For the past year, Richard had been desperately begging his banks for extensions. He had been scrambling for liquidity, trying to scrape together enough cash just to make the minimum interest payments on his toxic commercial loans. He had laid off his loyal staff. He had stopped construction on his legacy projects. He had watched his life's work slowly suffocate because he lacked basic operating capital. $3 million in liquid cash could have easily covered his quarterly interest payments. $3 million could have kept the bank satisfied for another 6 months. It could have prevented Vanguard Capital from ever stepping in and buying his debt for pennies on the dollar. The realization hit Richard like a physical blow. His own daughter and son-in-law had possessed the exact amount of money needed to save Kensington real estate from bankruptcy, but they had stolen it to buy designer clothes and private jet rides instead. They had let his empire burn to the ground so they could take vacations in the Maldives. Richard let out a roar of absolute primal rage. It was a sound completely devoid of any aristocratic dignity. He pushed past his weeping wife and lunged directly toward the bottom of the stage, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "You stole from me!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of devastation and homicidal fury. "You let my company die." Caroline, realizing that her own daughter was the reason her luxury lifestyle was officially gone, snapped completely. She dropped her diamond clutch purse and charged toward Brittany, her face twisted into a mask of vicious fury. The unified, untouchable Kensington family front had officially shattered. Caroline lunged forward, her manicured hands curling into claws as she grabbed fistfuls of Brittany's designer silk dress. "You ungrateful little parasite!" Caroline shrieked, her voice echoing wildly through the grand ballroom. "We gave you everything. We bought you that house. We paid for your wedding. And you stole the very money that could have kept a roof over our heads." Brittany screamed frantically, trying to pry her mother's hands off her collar. "Stop it, Mom! You are ruining my dress!" At the exact same moment, Richard threw his entire body weight at Jamal. He grabbed the lapels of Jamal's custom Tom Ford suit and shoved the taller, much younger man backward against the heavy mahogany podium. "I trusted you with my entire life's work," Richard bellowed, spit flying into Jamal's face. "You were supposed to be my legal shield. Instead, you gutted me like a fish. I am going to make sure you rot in a federal cell for the rest of your pathetic life." For a brief second, Jamal tried to maintain his composed alpha male lawyer facade. He tried to brush Richard off with a condescending sneer. But Richard swung a wild, uncoordinated punch that caught Jamal squarely on the jaw. It was not a physically hard hit, but the sheer public disrespect of it caused something extremely dark inside Jamal to finally snap. The polished, articulate corporate lawyer vanished in an instant. The mask of high society elegance fell away, revealing the ruthless, self-serving opportunist underneath. Jamal violently shoved the exhausted older man forcefully backward. Richard stumbled awkwardly, his expensive leather shoes slipping dangerously on the scattered white rose petals, and crashed hard onto the polished stone floor. "Do not you ever touch me again, you pathetic old dinosaur!" Jamal roared, his chest heaving. His voice boomed over the speakers, carrying the raw, unfiltered truth to every single wealthy investor watching the spectacle. "You want to talk about ruining this family? You ruined Kensington real estate years before I even walked into the picture." Jamal pointed a furious, shaking finger down at his father-in-law. "You are a terrible businessman, Richard. You refuse to adapt to the modern market. You over-leveraged every single commercial property you owned because you were too proud to admit you were losing your edge. You took out massive loans to build luxury condos nobody wanted to buy, just so you could see your name plastered on the side of a building. The ship was sinking rapidly, and everyone with half a brain in the financial district knew it." Jamal turned to face the shocked crowd of high society elites no longer caring about preserving the Kensington name. He was entirely focused on preserving his own ego. "Why should Brittany and I go down with your sinking ship?" he demanded, gesturing wildly toward Richard. "I spent 3 years cleaning up your massive legal messes. I spent 3 years lying to your investors and covering up your gross financial negligence. That $3 million was not theft. It was my severance package. It was the absolute minimum I was owed for putting up with your incompetent leadership." A collective gasp of sheer disbelief echoed through the ballroom. Calling the theft of charity funds a severance package was a level of sociopathic entitlement that even the most ruthless Wall Street bankers in the room found entirely repulsive. "You are a monster!" Caroline shrieked, letting go of Brittany to glare at her son-in-law. "You married into this family just to drain us dry." Jamal let out a loud, humorless laugh. "Oh, please, Caroline," he sneered, looking her up and down with absolute disgust. "Do not stand there and act like a victim. You knew exactly how bad the finances were, but you refused to stop spending. You forced Richard to take out another $1 million loan just to pay for this ridiculous wedding today, because you could not stand the thought of your country club friends thinking you were broke. You are the one who drained him dry." The immaculate, pristine image of the Kensington family was now shattered into a million irreparable pieces. They were not American royalty. They were a pack of rabid wolves turning on each other the second the meat ran out. Suddenly a loud, piercing sob cut through the chaotic shouting. It was Brittany. She had collapsed onto her knees, her custom silk dress pooled around her on the floor, weeping quite hysterically. Her heavy makeup was running down her face in dark streaks. "You made me do it!" "Mom," Brittany wailed, pointing a trembling finger at Caroline. "You forced me to steal. You told me I had to maintain the perfect rich daughter aesthetic, or I would be an absolute embarrassment to this family." The chaotic screaming on the ballroom floor reached a fever pitch. Richard clutched his chest, his face turning purple with rage while Caroline hurled vicious, completely unhinged insults at Brittany. Jamal was frantically shouting back at both of them. The pristine Kensington family had officially dissolved into a violent mob turning on each other. I stood perfectly still on the stage watching the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to throw my mother out. Then a sudden movement in my peripheral vision caught my attention. Preston, who had been completely silent since I revealed the Vanguard Capital documents, finally moved. He looked at his fighting parents in disgust. Like a true narcissist, Preston realized the luxury ship was rapidly sinking, and he had zero intention of going down with his family. He had spent his entire life coasting on his father's massive wealth. Now that the money was gone, he needed a new host. He needed a lifeline, and right now the only person holding any real power was me. Preston slowly turned his back on his screaming family and walked deliberately toward the stage. His face transformed instantly. The arrogant smirk he had worn when mocking my mother's vintage dress was completely gone. In its place was a look of absolute manufactured devastation. He stopped at the bottom of the velvet stairs. Then in his custom-tailored tuxedo, Preston dropped hard to his knees on the cold stone floor. "Vanessa," He choked out his voice, cracking perfectly for dramatic effect. He reached up and grabbed the edge of my silk wedding dress, burying his face in the expensive fabric. I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry. I did not pull my dress away. I just looked down at him, keeping my hand steady on the heavy microphone stand. The entire ballroom somehow felt intensely focused on us. The guests watched in stunned, breathless silence as the golden boy groveled pathetically at the feet of the woman he had just publicly humiliated. I swear to you, Vanessa, I had absolutely no idea, Preston cried, lifting his head so everyone could see his pain. Tears were streaming down his handsome face. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. I did not know about the massive debt or the forged bank signatures, and I swear I had no clue Jamal and Brittany were stealing from a charity. I am just as shocked and betrayed as you are today. He squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a sharp, trembling breath. My family is incredibly toxic, he sobbed, his voice echoing loudly over the speakers. They are greedy monsters. They lied to me just like they lied to you. You were right to expose them. You were right to burn this all down. They deserve everything happening to them today. I listened to him throw his own parents and his sister completely under the bus without a single second of hesitation. It was breathtakingly cold. But not me, Vanessa Preston pleaded, opening his eyes and looking up at me with absolute desperation. I am not like them. I love you. I have loved you since the very first day we met. I did not care that you were an administrative assistant. I just want you. Please believe me. Let them rot in their own mess. Preston begged, his voice dropping to an intimate, frantic whisper that the closest guests could still clearly hear. We do not need them. We can walk away right now. Just you and me. We can leave Rhode Island today. We can start fresh somewhere else. I will prove to you every single day for the rest of my life that my love is real. Please, Vanessa, do not let their toxic crimes destroy what we have built. I was scared of my parents, but I am choosing you now. Preston remained on his knees, his face stained with crocodile tears, looking up at me like a frightened, repentant child. He genuinely believed his handsome face and his pathetic apologies could manipulate me one last time. He thought he played the perfect victim card. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. Even Caroline and Richard stopped screaming, turning to watch their favorite son beg for his financial life. The elite investors, the politicians, and my mother stared at me, waiting to see if my resolve would finally break. I looked down at the man I had almost married. My expression was completely unreadable. My eyes were blank, my posture rigid. I did not yell. I did not sneer. For a long, agonizing second, I just stared at him in total silence. And in that terrifying silence, the audience wondered if I might forgive him. I let the heavy weight of that moment stretch out and finally linger. I let the silence stretch until it became almost physically painful for the people watching. The grand ballroom was entirely still. Only the sound of Caroline weeping softly in the background broke the quiet. Preston knelt before me on the cold stone floor, his eyes wide and hopeful, waiting for his salvation. Slowly, I allowed my rigid posture to soften. I let out a trembling breath, releasing the tension in my shoulders. I tilted my head, letting a look of profound vulnerability wash over my face. I reached out my right hand and gently placed my palm against Preston's damp cheek. He immediately closed his eyes and leaned into my touch like a starved man finding water in the desert. A collective sigh seemed to ripple through the audience. They thought they were witnessing a moment of ultimate forgiveness. The elite guests, accustomed to women trading their dignity for financial security, thought the poor working-class girl was simply too deeply in love to walk away from her handsome prince, even after everything his family had done. Preston, I whispered, keeping my voice soft and melodic, making sure the microphone picked up every delicate syllable. Do you really mean that? Do you truly love me for who I am? Because I need to know that you never cared about the money. I need to know that you would be perfectly happy walking away from the Kensington Empire today with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back just to be with me." Preston vehemently nodded his head, his eyes snapping open. He grabbed my hand and pressed it tightly against his face. "Yes," he cried out, his voice ringing with passionate conviction. "Vanessa, I swear it on my life. I never cared about the money. I hate this empire. I hate the pressure they put on me to be the perfect wealthy son. You are the only real thing I have ever had. You are the only good thing in my entire life." He was delivering an absolute masterclass in manipulation. His voice broke at the perfect moments. His tears flowed naturally. He painted himself as the tragic victim of his parents' ruthless ambition, a hostage in his own home who only wanted to escape with the woman he loved. "I would work a minimum wage job for the rest of my life if it meant I could wake up next to you every morning," Preston declared, his chest heaving with manufactured emotion. "I do not need the trust fund. I do not need the cars. I just need you. Please, Vanessa. Let us leave this poison behind." Then, recognizing that he needed to completely seal the performance to guarantee his financial rescue, Preston did something truly extraordinary. He let go of my hand, turned his body, and literally crawled on his hands and knees across the stone floor toward my mother. Ruth took a startled step back, but Preston threw himself at her feet. He grabbed the hem of her handmade vintage dress, the very dress his mother had publicly mocked just an hour ago. "Ruth, please forgive me," Preston begged, sobbing loudly as he looked up at the older woman. "I am so incredibly sorry for what Caroline said to you. I was paralyzed by fear. My parents have emotionally abused me for years, and I was too much of a coward to stand up to them on that terrace. You raised an incredible, brilliant daughter. You are 10 times the woman my mother will ever be. I am begging you for your blessing. Let me take your daughter away from this toxic family and treat her like the queen she truly is." My mother looked down at the weeping heir to the Kensington fortune. She did not say a single word. She simply lifted her gaze from the floor and looked directly at me. Preston turned his head back toward me, a pathetic, hopeful smile forming on his lips. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully manipulated the emotional woman into saving him from the absolute wreckage of his own life. My gentle, merciful smile remained for exactly 1 second longer. Then it vanished entirely. The soft vulnerability in my eyes hardened into chips of solid ice. My face twisted into a mask of absolute chilling disgust. I looked at my right hand, the one that had just touched his cheek, and deliberately wiped my palm against the side of my silk gown, as if the mere physical contact with his skin had deeply contaminated me. Preston noticed the shift immediately. His hopeful smile faltered. The color rapidly drained from his face as he realized the safety net he thought he had woven was completely imaginary. "Vanessa," he stammered, his voice suddenly small and terrified. I did not answer him. I took a slow, measured step back, creating a physical boundary between us. With calculated precision, I reached down and opened the small diamond-encrusted bridle clutch resting on the podium beside me. I ignored my lipstick and the emergency sewing kit. Instead, I reached my fingers inside and pulled out a sleek silver USB drive. I held the small silver metal drive up in the air between my thumb and index finger. It caught the light of the crystal chandeliers overhead, glittering like a tiny lethal weapon. Preston stared at it, his tears instantly drying up. The manufactured sorrow on his face melted into genuine confusion, quickly followed by a creeping sense of absolute dread. "What is that silver thing?" he whispered, his voice trembling as he remained frozen on his knees. I did not answer him directly. Instead, I raised my microphone and addressed the hundreds of elite guests watching from the ballroom floor. For the last few weeks, I had a lingering thought in the back of my mind. I explained, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, as if I were giving a keynote speech at a corporate summit. I knew about the massive corporate debt. I knew about the Delaware shell companies. I knew about the charity embezzlement. But a small, foolish part of me wondered if maybe, just maybe, Preston was actually innocent. I looked down at him. I wondered if he was just a pawn in his parents' toxic game, oblivious to the financial crimes happening under his own roof. I wanted to believe that the man I was about to marry was just a victim of circumstance, someone who genuinely loved me and would choose me over the Kensington Empire when the truth finally came to light. But in my line of work at Vanguard Capital, we do not rely on hope or blind faith. We rely on data. We rely on verified intelligence. I turned my head and locked eyes with the head audio-visual technician standing at the soundboard near the stage. Like the security team, he had also received a very generous wire transfer from my personal account that morning. I stepped to the edge of the podium and tossed the silver USB drive perfectly into his waiting hands. So to gather that intelligence, I decided to make a small personal investment. I continued pacing slowly across the stage as the technician quickly plugged the drive into the main console. Last night, while Preston was celebrating his final hours of freedom at his lavish bachelor party in a private penthouse suite downtown, I hired a private investigator. Preston physically recoiled as if I had just slapped him across the face. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees, his designer tuxedo pants scraping awkwardly against the cold stone floor. My investigator did not sit in a car across the street taking blurry photographs. I clarified, enjoying the absolute horror washing over Preston's face. He is a highly trained professional. He secured a temporary job for the evening. He spent the entire night inside your private penthouse suite, posing as the primary bartender. He poured your expensive scotch. He handed out your premium cigars. And for 6 solid hours, he wore a highly sensitive state-of-the-art recording device hidden perfectly inside his vest. A massive audio waveform suddenly appeared on the giant LED screen behind me, replacing the Cayman Islands bank statements. It was a stark, bright green line, waiting to pulse with sound. Carolyn gasped loudly from the floor, realizing her son's deepest, darkest secrets were about to be broadcast to the entire Rhode Island high society. "Stop it!" she shrieked, struggling to stand up. "You have no right to do this. This is an invasion of privacy." I ignored her pathetic outburst entirely. I kept my eyes locked solely on Preston. "You just swore on your life that you loved me for who I am," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper that echoed menacingly through the speakers. "You just crawled on your hands and knees and begged my mother for forgiveness. You put on a brilliant, heartbreaking performance, Preston. But let us see what you sound like when you think there are no consequences. Let us see how you talk about me to your closest friends when the cameras are off and the expensive liquor is flowing." Preston scrambled to his feet. He lunged frantically toward the soundboard, desperate to physically rip the USB drive out of the computer. But the event's security captain stepped effortlessly into his path, placing a massive, unyielding hand firmly against Preston's chest, shoving him roughly back into the center aisle. Preston stumbled back, breathing heavily, completely trapped in a cage of his own making. I looked at the audio technician and gave him a sharp, decisive nod. The technician hit the space bar. First, the speakers hissed with the ambient noise of a high-end party, the clinking of heavy crystal tumblers, the faint thumping of loud bass club music playing in the background, and the raucous, overlapping cheers of several men. Then Preston's slurred, arrogant voice boomed through the massive speakers of the ballroom, laughing hysterically with his drunk groomsmen. The laughter echoed off the crystal chandeliers and the towering marble columns, thick and heavy with the absolute confidence of men who believed they were utterly invincible. Then came the unmistakable clink of a heavy crystal whiskey tumbler hitting a glass table. "Are you kidding me right now?" Preston's voice blasted through the state-of-the-art sound system, sounding incredibly loud and profoundly arrogant. "You guys actually think I am tying the knot tomorrow because I am madly in love with a glorified secretary?" A collective, horrified gasp sucked all the oxygen out of the grand ballroom. Down on the floor, Preston curled into a tight ball, wrapping his arms around his head, as if he could physically shield himself from the sound of his own voice. "I am marrying this poor girl for one reason and one reason only." The recorded Preston continued, the words dripping with casual cruelty. "My grandfather was a controlling old tyrant. His ironclad will explicitly stipulates that I have to be legally married before my 35th birthday to unlock my $10 million personal trust fund. I turn 35 on Tuesday, gentlemen. This entire wedding is just a massive, incredibly expensive administrative hoop I have to jump through to get my cash. The sheer sociopathic calculation in his voice made the blood run cold in the veins of everyone listening. Several elite guests, who had just minutes ago felt a twinge of sympathy for Preston when he cried on his knees, now stared at him with absolute unfiltered revulsion. He had just delivered a passionate monologue about how I was the only good thing in his life. Now, the entire room knew his tears were nothing more than a desperate performance to save his own skin. "But why her man?" one of his groomsmen asked on the recording, his voice slurred and sloppy. "You could have had any wealthy socialite in the city. You could have married someone in our circle. Because she is incredibly easy to manage." Preston scoffed over the speakers, followed by the sound of him lighting a premium cigar. "I specifically picked a girl from a nobody background. No family money, no corporate connections, and absolutely no father figure to step in and ask the hard financial questions or hire his own legal counsel to look over the paperwork." I glanced over at my mother. Ruth stood tall, her jaw set firmly, but I could see the fresh tears welling in her eyes. Hearing a man reduce her entire life of hard work and sacrifice to a joke for his rich friends was a deeply painful blow. "Her mother runs some tiny irrelevant neighborhood bakery." Preston continued on the audio, his tone dripping with condescension. "They are practically peasants compared to our social circles. If you give a girl like Vanessa a tiny taste of actual luxury, buy her a few nice steak dinners, and let her ride in the back of a Maybach, she will be so utterly blinded by the Kensington name that she will happily sign whatever draconian prenuptial agreement Jamal slides across the table. She will not even bother to read the fine print. She will just be desperate to lock down the lifestyle." Jamal flinched violently at the mention of his name, stepping further back into the shadows of the ballroom. He had drafted that exact prenuptial agreement, fully aware that it was designed to leave me completely destitute when Preston inevitably discarded me. The cruelty of his master plan was staggering. He had spent 2 years of his life playing the role of a loving boyfriend, deceiving me, meeting my mother, and planning a future, all while secretly treating me like a disposable tool to unlock his inheritance. He targeted me specifically because he thought my lack of wealth made me weak. He thought my lack of a father made me vulnerable. He had it all figured out down to the exact dollar amount he believed my dignity was worth. He genuinely believed that a working-class woman would accept being thrown away like garbage as long as she received a tiny financial payoff. "So what is the exit strategy here?" the drunken groomsman asked on the recording. "You cannot stay married to a nobody forever. It will ruin your brand." The audio captured the sound of Preston taking a long, arrogant sip of his expensive whiskey. The ballroom was so completely silent that you could hear the ice cubes clinking in his glass through the speakers. When he spoke again, his voice was lowered, filled with the supreme, terrifying confidence of a predator who firmly believed he had outsmarted his prey. "1 year," Preston announced smoothly. "I will give her exactly 1 year to make it look legitimate for the estate lawyers. Then I will file for divorce, toss her a $50,000 settlement, and keep the 10 million for myself. She will be so grateful for the scraps she will probably send me a thank you note." The audio file ended with a sharp, definitive click. The silence that washed over the grand ballroom was not just deafening. It was suffocating. It was the heavy, terrifying silence of a complete and total social execution. Preston remained frozen on his knees at the bottom of the velvet stairs. His handsome face was completely slack, his eyes wide and vacant as the echoing sound of his own cruel laughter slowly faded from the towering speakers. He did not try to offer another pathetic excuse. He did not cry. The pristine, charming mask he had worn for 35 years had just been violently ripped off, leaving absolutely nothing underneath but a hollow, calculating coward. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Then the high society crowd reacted with the ruthless efficiency that only the ultra-wealthy possess. Hundreds of smartphones were simultaneously whipped out of designer pockets and expensive clutch purses. The dim ballroom suddenly lit up with the rapid, blinding flashes of camera lenses. The prominent investors, the socialites who had kissed Caroline's cheeks, and the business partners who had played golf with Richard were all furiously recording the wreckage. Videos of the golden boy of Newport groveling on the floor were being instantly uploaded to social media. Group chats across the East Coast were already exploding with the audio clip of his horrific confession. Within seconds, Preston was not just exposed in that room, he was a global pariah. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical satisfaction. "You planned everything so perfectly, Preston?" I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the frantic whispering and the clicking cameras. "You found the perfect victim. A poor girl with a widowed mother who you thought would be so dazzled by your wealth that she would never see the knife you were holding behind your back. You were going to use my life as a stepping stone to unlock your fortune and then throw me away like garbage with a $50,000 check." Preston slowly raised his head. His breathing was shallow and erratic. "Vanessa," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "I am not finished," I commanded, silencing him instantly. "You see, when I was digging through the financial records of Kensington real estate, I did not just look at the corporate debt. I also took a very close look at the exact structure of your grandfather's estate. He was a ruthless man, but he was also a brilliant businessman." I stepped down the first velvet stair, bringing myself closer to his eye level. "He did not leave your $10 million trust fund in a liquid cash account, Preston. He did not leave it in gold bars or secure government bonds. He wanted you to have a vested interest in the family legacy, so he tied your inheritance directly to the company. Your entire $10 million trust is held exclusively in Class A shares of Kensington real estate." Richard let out a sharp, devastated groan from across the room, suddenly realizing the horrific financial math I was about to lay out. "When a company is healthy, those shares are worth a fortune," I explained, making sure to enunciate every single syllable for the investors furiously recording the speech. "But as I just demonstrated on that massive screen behind me, your company is not healthy. It is entirely insolvent. And when a massive private equity firm like Vanguard Capital buys up $45 million of senior secured debt and forces a company into Chapter 11, bankruptcy, the very first thing that happens is the complete equity wipeout of the common stock." I paused, letting the reality of the situation hover in the air like a guillotine blade. "Your shares are worthless, Preston. They are mathematically valued at absolute zero. Your $10 million trust fund does not exist anymore. It evaporated the exact second I signed the debt acquisition papers yesterday morning." The crowd gasped again, the sheer, brutal poetry of the financial takedown, leaving them completely stunned. "You spent 2 years of your life lying to me," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving register. "You manipulated my mother. You planned to ruin my future. You humiliated yourself by begging on your hands and knees in front of half of Rhode Island. And you went through all of this for absolutely nothing. You do not get the girl. You do not get the money. You get nothing." Preston stared at me, his eyes darting frantically back and forth as his brain tried to process the catastrophic information. He had played the ultimate game of deception, and he had lost everything. The wealth that defined his entire existence was gone. The social status that shielded him from consequences was destroyed. The safety net was cut. A terrifying, vacant look washed over his features. Preston's mind finally snapped. He realized he was penniless, humiliated, and utterly exposed. Caroline watched her golden boy crumble onto the floor, and something inside her perfectly manicured, deeply artificial facade violently fractured. For 3 decades, Caroline had carefully constructed an identity based entirely on the intimidation of others. She had weaponized her last name, her massive diamond rings, and her exclusive country club memberships to crush anyone she deemed socially inferior. Now stripped of the millions she thought protected her, she was nothing more than a broke, aging woman standing in a rented venue she could not afford. The rapid clicking of the smartphone cameras surrounding her acted like physical blows. Every single flash from the elite investors and former friends captured her profound humiliation. They were no longer looking at her with envy. They were looking at her with deep, unfiltered pity and absolute revulsion. That sudden shift in social power was far more agonizing to her than the loss of the money itself. She could not accept that her entire empire was gone. She desperately needed a scapegoat. She needed someone beneath her to absorb the catastrophic damage of this public execution. Her wild, bloodshot eyes frantically scanned the grand ballroom and finally locked onto the one person she had targeted from the very beginning. My mother. A sound tore from Caroline's throat that did not belong at a luxury wedding. It was a guttural, feral scream of absolute desperation and blinding rage. It echoed loudly off the marble walls, startling the guests who immediately backed away from her in horror. Caroline completely abandoned the aristocratic poise she had spent a lifetime practicing. She kicked off her expensive designer heels, the sharp stilettos clattering against the stone floor, and charged directly toward the edge of the stage. Her couture gown tore at the seams as she lunged forward, her arms outstretched, her manicured fingers curling into vicious claws. She was entirely unhinged, driven by a primal need to inflict physical pain. "You peasant woman," Caroline shrieked, her voice cracking under the sheer force of her hysteria. "You did this! You and your witch daughter ruined our lives! You disgusting, pathetic nobodies came into my house and stole everything we had! I am going to kill you! I am going to tear you apart!" She completely bypassed her weeping daughter, ignored her paralyzed husband, and scrambled up the velvet stairs toward my mother. Ruth stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock, as the enraged matriarch hurtled toward her like a rabid animal. I did not even hesitate. I dropped the heavy silver microphone onto the podium, the loud thud echoing through the massive speakers, and stepped swiftly in front of my mother. I became an immovable physical shield between the woman who raised me and the unhinged monster who wanted to destroy her. Caroline swung her arm wildly, aiming a vicious open-handed slap directly at my mother's face. But her hand never made contact. My arm shot up with lightning speed. I caught Caroline's wrist mid-air. My grip was absolute steel. I dug my fingers fiercely into the delicate bones of her forearm, halting her chaotic momentum instantly. The sudden jarring stop sent a shockwave of pain up her arm, and she let out a sharp gasp. The heavy diamond bracelet she wore clinked loudly against my knuckles. For a split second, Caroline tried to yank her arm free, thrashing her body weight backward, but I held her firmly in place. I squeezed her wrist much harder, letting her feel the undeniable physical strength that perfectly mirrored the absolute financial power I now held over her entire existence. She was completely trapped in my grasp. The chaotic screaming in the ballroom faded into a tense, breathless silence as the wealthy guests watched the physical standoff on the stage. Caroline stared at me, her chest heaving violently, her perfect makeup ruined by sweat and heavy tears of rage. The aristocratic superiority was entirely gone, replaced by the sheer terror of a woman who finally realized she was completely powerless. She looked deep into my eyes frantically, searching for a single ounce of fear or intimidation, but she found absolutely nothing but cold, clinical authority. I slowly pulled her wrist closer to my body, forcing her to step uncomfortably near to me. I leaned in my face mere inches from hers. The scent of her expensive floral perfume was suffocating, mixed heavily with the sharp, bitter tang of her panicked sweat. I kept my voice incredibly low, ensuring that only she could hear the final nail being hammered into her coffin before the authorities arrived. "I didn't ruin you," I whispered my words, slicing through the tense air like a freshly sharpened blade. "I just turned on the lights so everyone could see the rot. And the show isn't over yet." With a sudden, forceful thrust, I released her wrist and shoved Caroline backward. She stumbled awkwardly on the stone floor, her torn couture gown tangling around her legs. Richard managed to catch her just before she hit the ground, wrapping his arms around his weeping, trembling wife. They collapsed together into a pathetic, defeated heap at the bottom of the stage, stripped entirely of the arrogance they had wielded like a weapon just an hour ago. I turned my back on them and casually picked up the heavy silver microphone from the podium. The feedback whined for a fraction of a second before I spoke, my voice ringing out with absolute clarity. You see, buying distressed corporate debt and orchestrating hostile takeovers is simply my day job, I announced to the silent, captivated ballroom. It pays incredibly well, but it is just business. However, I am also an upstanding citizen. And in my specific line of work, we are bound by very strict federal reporting guidelines. We do not ignore fraud to protect the delicate feelings of the socially elite. I paced slowly along the edge of the stage, my eyes sweeping over the pale faces of Jamal, Brittany, and Preston. When my forensic accountants uncovered the Delaware shell companies, I knew we were dealing with more than just terrible business management. When we traced the stolen charity funds across international borders into the Cayman Islands, the situation escalated significantly. But when I found Richard's forged signatures on federally protected bank documents, the legal reality shifted entirely. You committed massive financial fraud across multiple state lines, I explained, pointing directly at Jamal, who was now sweating profusely. You utilized electronic banking networks to embezzle millions of dollars from a registered charitable organization. That is not a civil dispute, Jamal. That is a severe violation of federal law. And as a senior executive at a major Wall Street firm, I am legally obligated to report those findings immediately. Several high-profile politicians in the room, realizing they were currently standing at the epicenter of a massive federal crime scene, began frantically whispering to their aides. They needed to distance themselves from the Kensington family immediately to avoid the inevitable media fallout. The social execution was complete, but the criminal execution was just beginning. The crowd of elite investors and socialites murmured nervously, finally understanding the catastrophic scale of the trap I had set. You thought I was just holding on to this information to humiliate you at a wedding, I asked, letting a dry, humorless laugh escape my lips. I am far more efficient than that. Yesterday afternoon, while Caroline was getting her hair professionally styled for the rehearsal dinner, I was sitting in a secure conference room at the Federal Building in Providence. I was not alone. I was sitting across a long table from a team of federal prosecutors. I handed them absolutely everything. The unredacted offshore bank statements, the fraudulent vendor contracts, the forged loan applications, and the explicit proof of your charity embezzlement. They were incredibly grateful for the neatly organized binders. Jamal took a frantic step backward, looking desperately toward the side exits, but the security guards I had hired remained planted firmly in front of every single door. The realization finally hit him. He was not just going to lose his license to practice law, he was going to lose his freedom. Brittany let out another piercing wail, covering her ears, as if she could block out the terrifying reality of my words. Preston, you thought you could trap me in a fraudulent marriage to unlock your precious trust fund, I said, looking down at his frozen form. But by demanding that every single member of your family be present here today to celebrate your fake union, you actually did the government a massive favor. You rounded up the entire criminal enterprise under one roof. I did not just bring your secrets to the wedding, I stated, my voice echoing with absolute finality. I brought them to the authorities, and I told them exactly where they could find all the primary suspects gathered conveniently in one room. Right on cue, a new terrifying sound cuts through the suffocating tension of the estate. They are not the soft, hesitant steps of catering staff or late-arriving guests. They are the hard, rhythmic strikes of tactical boots marching purposefully against the polished marble floors. The sound grows louder, vibrating through the walls and sending a final, paralyzing wave of dread over the Kensington family. The event security captain catches my eye from across the room and gives a single crisp nod of confirmation. He raises his hand, signaling his men. Heavy, synchronized footsteps echo from the hallway outside the grand ballroom. The security guards unlock the massive main doors. The heavy brass handles of the grand mahogany doors turned with a loud metallic clack. As the heavy wood swung outward, the bright afternoon sunlight from the hallway flooded into the dim, tension-filled ballroom. But the light did not bring any relief. It illuminated the terrifying reality that I had just promised. Marching through the arched entryway in perfect intimidating synchronization was a dozen federal agents. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with the letters FBI emblazoned across their chests in bright, unmissable yellow text. The stark contrast between their heavy utility belts and the delicate white floral arrangements decorating the entrance was incredibly jarring. This was no longer a high society gathering, it was an active federal crime scene. Directly behind the first wave of FBI agents came a second, equally intimidating group. These agents wore dark suits and carried thick leather briefcases. The subtle badges clipped to their belts identified them as the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Wall Street executives often joked that they feared the IRS far more than the FBI, because while the FBI could put you in prison, the IRS would systematically strip away every single dime you ever claimed to own before they locked the cell door. The elite guests in the ballroom completely lost their composure. The politicians, the wealthy investors, and the socialites who had spent the entire afternoon sipping vintage champagne immediately scrambled out of the center aisle. They pushed against each other, desperate to avoid making eye contact with the federal agents. In the world of the ultra-wealthy, proximity to an active federal investigation is like a highly contagious disease. Nobody wanted to be caught in the background of a photograph standing next to the Kensington family while warrants were being executed. The path from the main doors directly to the stage cleared in a matter of seconds. The lead FBI agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with closely cropped gray hair and an expression carved from solid granite, led the march down the white-carpeted aisle. His heavy tactical boots crushed the scattered white rose petals that my mother and I had walked past just an hour earlier. He did not look left or right at the terrified high society crowd. His eyes were locked dead ahead, scanning the stage and the broken family cowering at the bottom of the velvet stairs. I stepped back, lowering the microphone to my side, and gestured openly toward the Kensington family. I had set the stage, delivered the evidence, and trapped the prey. Now it was time for the federal government to collect. Jamal frantically backed away, bumping hard into a decorated dining table. His legal mind was racing, trying to formulate a defense, but the sheer presence of the IRS criminal investigation agents told him that his offshore accounts had already been fully breached. Brittany let out a terrified whimper and tried to hide behind her father. Richard remained on his knees, clutching his chest, his face pale and completely devoid of the arrogant pride he had worn for 30 years. Preston simply stared at the approaching agents with vacant, dead eyes, his mind entirely broken by the realization that his $10 million trust fund was gone and federal prison was his new reality. Caroline was the only one who tried to speak. She reached out a trembling hand toward the lead agent as he stopped at the base of the stage. "Please," Caroline cried, her voice incredibly weak and pathetic. "There has been a terrible misunderstanding. We are the Kensington family. You cannot just march into our private event like this. We know the governor." The tall lead agent did not even acknowledge her pathetic existence. He looked right past her, holding up a thick stack of manila folders sealed with official government stamps. He pulled a folded piece of paper from the top folder, snapped it open with a sharp flick of his wrist, and cleared his throat. His deep, steady voice boomed across the completely silent ballroom, requiring no microphone to command absolute authority over everyone present. Richard Kensington, Preston Kensington, Jamal Washington. Brittany Washington, the agent announced loudly, reading the names off the printed documents with cold, mechanical precision. Every single person in the room held their breath, waiting for the final blow to land. "I have multiple federal arrest warrants officially issued by the United States District Court for the District of Rhode Island. You are all being taken into federal custody immediately. Do not attempt to move, resist, or flee this venue under any circumstances whatsoever. The official charges against you include multiple counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive corporate income tax evasion, and the illegal embezzlement of over $3 million from a completely registered charitable youth foundation. The lead agent did not wait for them to process the catastrophic weight of those words. He gave a short, sharp hand signal to the officers standing behind him. They moved forward with ruthless, practiced efficiency. The entire grand ballroom, which had been meticulously designed to host a fairy tale wedding, was instantly transformed into a sterile processing center. The soft classical music from the string quartet had long since died. Now the only sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings was the harsh, heavy clicking of solid steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly shut. Richard was the first to be restrained. An agent hauled him roughly to his feet. The aging patriarch did not even fight back. He simply held his hands out. His shoulders slumped in absolute defeat as the cold metal locked around his wrists. His custom-tailored suit jacket bunched awkwardly at his shoulders, ruining the immaculate billionaire aesthetic he had maintained for decades. Jamal, however, refused to go down quietly. The sheer arrogance of the corporate lawyer flared up one last time. As two federal agents approached him, he puffed out his chest and raised his hands aggressively. "Do not touch me," Jamal barked, his voice echoing over the terrified whispers of the crowd. "I am the chief legal officer of Kensington Real Estate. I know exactly how this works. I am formally invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, and I demand the immediate presence of my outside legal counsel. You cannot arrest me without allowing me to contact my attorney first." The lead FBI agent did not even blink. He stepped right up to Jamal, invading his personal space, and looked him dead in the eye. "You can call whoever you want from the holding cell." The agent stated, his voice incredibly dry and entirely unimpressed. "But I strongly suggest you save your quarter. We already seized the corporate servers this morning. We have every single one of your encrypted emails, your offshore transfer receipts, and the fake vendor contracts you drafted. Your legal counsel is going to be way too busy trying to keep themselves out of federal prison to pick up your phone call." Jamal opened his mouth to argue, but the words completely failed him. The realization that his brilliant legal mind had been entirely outmaneuvered finally hit him. An agent grabbed his arm, spun him around, and slammed the handcuffs onto his wrists with a sickening click. The alpha male lawyer was instantly reduced to a helpless, terrified criminal. Next to him, Preston completely fell apart. The golden boy of Newport, the man who had confidently planned to steal $10 million and toss me aside with a tiny settlement, dissolved into a puddle of absolute cowardice. He sobbed uncontrollably as an agent grabbed his arm. Mom, Preston wailed, twisting his head to look at Caroline. "Mom, please do something. Call the governor. Call the judges. You have to stop them. They cannot put me in a police car. I cannot go to jail." But Caroline could do absolutely nothing. She stood frozen on the stone patio, her hands covering her mouth in sheer horror as she watched her favorite son being physically restrained. Preston wept like a terrified child, begging for a rescue that simply did not exist anymore. Brittany was in an even worse state. As a female agent approached her and gently but firmly grabbed her wrists, Brittany let out an ear-splitting scream. "Get your hands off my dress!" she shrieked, thrashing her body wildly. "Do you know how much this silk costs? You are going to tear it!" The agent ignored her hysterical outburst completely and calmly began reciting her Miranda rights, while locking the steel cuffs tightly around Brittany's wrists. The visual contrast was profoundly satisfying. Seeing these deeply arrogant, entitled people being walk down the white-carpeted center aisle in their expensive designer wedding attire was a masterpiece of poetic justice. The custom tuxedos and the couture gowns clashed spectacularly with the cold, heavy steel of the federal handcuffs. They marched past the towering floral arrangements and the crystal champagne towers, completely humiliated in front of the exact high society crowd they had spent their entire lives trying to impress. I watched them disappear through the grand mahogany doors, escorted by the sea of yellow FBI windbreakers. The heavy doors slammed shut behind them, sealing their fate. The stage was suddenly very empty. Caroline was the only Kensington left standing, because her name was not explicitly on the forged bank documents or the offshore shell accounts the agents had left her behind, but she was now completely alone. Her husband, her son, her daughter, and her son-in-law were gone. Her wealth was gone. Her empire was gone. Caroline slowly turned around to face the elite guests still lingering in the ballroom. Her makeup was entirely ruined, her hair was a mess, and her eyes were wide with desperate, frantic hope. She looked at the billionaires, the politicians, and the socialites she had called her closest friends for decades. "Please," Caroline begged, her voice trembling as she clasped her hands together. "I need your help to cover their bail." The silence that followed Caroline's desperate plea was absolute and profoundly cruel. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life navigating the complex, ruthless social hierarchies of Newport and Manhattan, that silence was a death sentence. She stood on the edge of the stone patio, her hands still clasped tightly together, waiting for just one person to step forward. She waited for one of the billionaires who had drank her husband's expensive scotch, or one of the socialites who had kissed her cheek and complimented her couture gowns, to offer a lifeline. Nobody moved toward her. Instead, a collective, almost synchronized physical recoil rippled through the high society crowd. Caroline locked eyes with Penelope, the president of the exclusive country club where Caroline had reigned supreme for the last 10 years. They had played tennis together every Tuesday. They had hosted charity galas side by side. Penelope, Caroline pleaded, her voice cracking as she took a hesitant step forward. "You know, Richard, you know he is a good man. Please, just a short-term loan until we can untangle this mess. I will pay you back with interest." Penelope did not offer a warm smile or a comforting embrace. Her expression hardened into a mask of pure, self-preserving ice. She took 2 deliberate steps backward, physically putting distance between herself and the disgraced matriarch. "I am incredibly sorry," Caroline Penelope said, her tone devoid of any genuine empathy. "But my financial advisors would absolutely crucify me if I entangled my personal assets in a federal wire fraud investigation. I really must be going. My driver is waiting outside." Penelope turned on her heel and walked briskly toward the side exit, not looking back once. Caroline gasped, the rejection hitting her like a physical blow. Panic completely overriding her remaining pride, she pivoted toward a small group of older men standing near the bar. They were prominent real estate developers and politicians, men who had profited immensely from Richard's past ventures. Winston, Caroline called out, targeting a wealthy state senator. "Winston, you have to help us. Your campaign was practically funded by the Kensington Foundation." Winston held up both hands, his face flushing a deep shade of crimson, as several other guests turned to stare at him. "Do not bring me into this." "Caroline," Winston hissed, his voice dropping to a frantic, angry whisper. "Your son-in-law just admitted to embezzling $3 million from a charity. The Kensington name is completely radioactive. If the press even thinks I am still associating with your family, my political career is entirely over. Do not ever call my office again." Winston grabbed his wife's arm and practically dragged her out of the ballroom, desperate to escape the blast radius of the Kensington implosion. Within minutes, the mass exodus began. The elite guests, the people Caroline had worshipped and catered to her entire life, hurried toward the exits like passengers fleeing a sinking luxury ocean liner. They actively avoided making eye contact with her. As they passed, Caroline could hear their vicious, unfiltered whispers. They were already tearing her reputation to shreds, calling her a fraud, a criminal accomplice, and a pathetic social climber who finally got exactly what she deserved. In the brutal transactional world of American high society, Caroline suddenly realized the ultimate terrifying truth. These people were never actually her friends. They did not care about her personality, her sharp wit, or her meticulous event planning skills. They only cared about her bank account. She was only as valuable as the money she could leverage and the luxury she could provide. Now that her accounts were frozen by Vanguard Capital, and her husband was sitting in the back of a federal vehicle, her social currency had dropped to absolute zero. She was entirely invisible. The reality of her complete and total isolation finally crushed her. Her legs shaking violently under the weight of her ruined silk gown simply gave out. Caroline collapsed heavily into one of the velvet dining chairs near the edge of the dance floor. She let out a hollow, agonizing sob, burying her face in her hands. The massive ballroom, which was supposed to be the site of her greatest social triumph, was now mostly empty, littered with shattered glass, abandoned champagne flutes, and scattered white rose petals. The fairy tale was over. She sat there completely broken, weeping into her hands as the catering staff began quietly clearing the tables around her, treating her like just another piece of garbage left behind after a party. Then the soft sound of leather shoes approaching broke through her sobbing. Caroline slowly lowered her hands, a tiny pathetic spark of hope reigniting in her chest. She thought someone had finally taken pity on her. But it was not a wealthy investor or a prominent socialite. Just as Caroline collapsed into the chair, the venue manager approached her holding a gleaming silver tray. The venue manager, a tall man with immaculate posture, stopped in front of Caroline. His expression was completely neutral, devoid of any sympathy. In the luxury event industry, loyalty only extends as far as the last cleared bank transfer. He gently placed the gleaming silver tray onto the table next to where she was sitting. Resting precisely in the center was a thick cream-colored envelope bearing the raised gold crest of the Newport estate. Caroline stared at the envelope, her red and swollen eyes blinking in confusion. "What is this?" she rasped, her throat raw from screaming. "It is the final invoice for today's event, Mrs. Kensington," the manager replied, maintaining a smooth, practiced politeness that made the situation even more chilling. The total balance for the catering, the imported floral arrangements, the string quartet, the premium open bar, and the exclusive estate rental fee comes to exactly $500,000. Caroline let out a weak laugh, shaking her head. "Richard handles the finances," she mumbled, waving her hand dismissively toward the door where her husband had just been hauled away by federal agents. "Send it to his corporate office, or run the card I put on file." The manager did not move. "I attempted to process the remaining balance on the corporate card you provided this morning," he explained calmly. "The transaction was declined. I then attempted to run the secondary personal platinum card you left for incidentals. That was also declined. Our merchant services provider informed us that every account associated with your name has been permanently frozen." Caroline felt the remaining blood drain from her face. "Well, I do not have it," she snapped, a brief flash of arrogance surfacing. "My husband was just arrested. My assets are tied up. You will have to wait until my lawyers sort this massive misunderstanding out. I am afraid we do not extend lines of credit for completed events," the manager said, his tone dropping an octave. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded copy of the master venue agreement. He pointed a manicured finger at the bottom of the last page. "When you demanded absolute creative control over this wedding, you insisted on signing the master contract yourself, right here under the title Mother of the Groom." Caroline stared at her own elegant signature in dark blue ink. "By signing this document," the manager continued relentlessly, "you legally agreed to act as the sole personal guarantor for the entire $500,000 balance. If the funds are not wired into our account by the end of business on Monday, our legal department will place an immediate lien on whatever personal property you possess, and we will pursue you in civil court for the full amount plus legal fees. Have a good day." The manager gave a crisp bow and walked away, leaving the envelope sitting on the tray like a ticking bomb. Caroline did not scream this time. She did not cry. The sheer weight of the financial reality simply short-circuited her brain. She owed $500,000 that she fundamentally did not have to people who would relentlessly hunt her down for it. She slumped back into the velvet chair, her arms falling limply to her sides. Her eyes glazed over, staring blankly at the crystal chandelier above. She went into a state of complete catatonic shock, trapped in the inescapable prison of her own massive debt. I watched her completely shut down from across the room. There was no joy in seeing another human being destroyed, but there was a deep sense of justice. The universe finally balanced the scales. I turned to my mother. She was standing quietly, her hands folded gracefully in front of her beautiful vintage dress. "Let us go home, Mom," I said softly. Ruth nodded, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "Yes," she agreed. "I think we have had enough high society for one day." I linked my arm through hers. Together we turned our backs on Caroline and began walking down the center aisle. We stepped over the crushed white rose petals and the shattered crystal glass, navigating through the wreckage of the Kensington Empire. We walked out of the ballroom and into the sunlit hallway leading toward the main exit. Just as we passed the coat check room, where the federal agents were temporarily holding the Kensington men before loading them into the transport vehicles, a desperate voice echoed off the marble walls. "Vanessa." It was Preston. He was pressed against the glass doors of the holding room, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. He called out my name one last time, his voice shattering with absolute despair. I stopped walking. The sharp, confident sound of my heels clicking against the polished marble floor ceased immediately, leaving only the muffled noises of the federal agents coordinating their transport logistics in the background. My mother paused right beside me, her hand resting gently on my arm. She did not flinch, and she certainly did not look away from the glass. She stood perfectly upright, radiating a quiet, unshakable dignity that the Kensington family had never possessed and could never simply buy. I turned slowly to face the coat check room. Preston was pressing his face and his shoulder aggressively against the heavy glass pane, leaving a large smudge of sweat on the pristine surface. His custom-tailored tuxedo was severely wrinkled, and his perfectly styled hair hung in completely disheveled strands across his forehead. He looked absolutely pathetic. He looked exactly like the terrified hollow shell of a man I had just exposed him to be. "Vanessa, please," Preston begged through the glass, his voice heavily muffled but entirely clear in its frantic desperation. "I know I messed up. I know I deserve this. But please have a little mercy today. You have all the power now. Just drop the corporate debt claims. Just release enough of the frozen assets so my father and Jamal can hire decent private defense attorneys. We cannot fight federal wire fraud charges with absolutely nothing. We are going to be completely destroyed." He was actually still trying to negotiate. Even with cold steel handcuffs digging deeply into his wrists and federal agents standing mere feet away, his deeply ingrained entitlement allowed him to believe he could still manipulate me into a financial compromise. He genuinely thought I would somehow fund his legal defense against the very financial crimes I had just reported to the authorities. I let go of my mother's arm and took 2 deliberate steps toward the glass door. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "You still do not understand what is happening here, Preston," I said, my voice incredibly cold and entirely steady. "You still think this is just a business transaction that went sour. You think you can just ask for a line of credit to fix the massive bleeding holes in your life, but you are completely bankrupt in every possible sense of the word." I looked him directly in his bloodshot eyes, ensuring he absorbed every single syllable of my final judgment. "For 2 years you sat at my dinner table." I continued my words, slicing effortlessly through the glass barrier. "You smiled at my mother. You ate the food she baked for you. You watched her work grueling hours at her bakery just to keep a roof over our heads, and you secretly laughed at us with your wealthy, arrogant friends. You assumed that because we did not have a massive trust fund or a summer house in Newport, we were inherently weak. You thought our kindness was a vulnerability you could easily exploit for a $10 million payout." Preston closed his eyes tightly, fresh tears leaking out and tracking rapidly down his flushed cheeks. "But your family made a fatal miscalculation," I told him, stepping even closer, so my face was only inches from the glass partition. "You see, true family is not defined by corporate ledgers, offshore bank accounts, or exclusive country club memberships. True family builds each other up. My mother and I survived because we actually love each other. We protect each other fiercely. Your family turned into a pack of rabid animals and tore each other to pieces the absolute second the money disappeared. You do not even know what true loyalty is. I paused briefly, letting the crushing reality of his total isolation sink deeply into his mind. Your parents raised a coward, and I refuse to finance a coward's legal defense. Please. Preston sobbed, leaning his forehead heavily against the glass. I am begging you. I delivered my final, unyielding boundary. Do not ever contact me again, Preston. Do not call me from the holding cell. Do not have your parents try to reach out to my firm. You no longer exist in my world. If you have anything else you want to say to me, my elite corporate lawyers will happily communicate with your court-appointed public defenders. Preston gasped out loud, the remaining color draining instantly from his face as the sheer terror of facing ruthless federal prosecutors with a free, overworked public defender finally registered in his brain. He slid slowly down the glass door, collapsing into a defeated heap on the coat check room floor. A federal agent immediately grabbed his collar and yanked him roughly back to his feet, hauling him away toward the back exit where the transport vehicles were waiting. I did not stay to watch him leave. I turned back to my mother and gently took her arm once again. She looked at me, her eyes shining with absolute pride and profound relief. The heavy toxic weight of the Kensington family was completely gone, leaving nothing but clear air in its wake. Together we walked away from the holding room. We pushed open the heavy front doors of the lavish estate and stepped out into the glorious bright afternoon sunlight. My mother's beautiful handmade vintage dress caught the gentle ocean breeze, the delicate fabric flowing perfectly around her. We walked down the sweeping stone steps with our heads held high, leaving the shattered, ruined remnants of the Kensington family entirely in the dark. 6 months later, the crisp autumn air carried a very different kind of energy. I stood in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling window in my Manhattan office, holding a warm cup of coffee, listening to the morning broadcast on the financial news network, playing softly in the background. The anchor's voice was sharp and clinical as she delivered the final update on what the media had dubbed the Newport nightmare. Richard Kensington was officially sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for massive corporate fraud and tax evasion. Jamal Washington, the brilliant legal mastermind who thought he could outsmart the government, received a 15-year sentence for his central role in the charity embezzlement scheme and for lying to federal investigators. His wife Brittany managed to negotiate a plea deal by flipping on her husband, but she still received 3 years in a minimum security facility for her direct participation in laundering the stolen funds. Preston was handed 5 years for conspiracy. He tried to cry during his sentencing hearing, but the federal judge was entirely unmoved by his crocodile tears. As for Caroline, she avoided jail time, but she lost absolutely everything else. She was currently living in a tiny one-bedroom apartment in upstate New York, working as a receptionist at a mid-level dental clinic, forever exiled from the high society she once ruled. I turned off the television with a simple click of the remote. Their chapter was permanently closed. I set my coffee down and grabbed my tailored wool coat. I had a much more important appointment to attend today. My private driver navigated the busy city streets and eventually pulled up to a massive construction site in the heart of the financial district. 6 months ago, this plot of land housed the towering, opulent headquarters of Kensington Real Estate. It was a monument to their unchecked greed. But when Vanguard Capital officially liquidated their assets, I did not just sell the building. I had it completely demolished. I watched the wrecking balls smash through the marble columns and the mahogany boardrooms until there was absolutely nothing left but a blank slate of dirt and concrete. Today, that blank slate was finally reborn. I stepped out of the car and walked toward a beautifully designed modern glass building. A large crowd was already gathered outside, but this was not a crowd of arrogant billionaires or snobbish socialites. This crowd was filled with hard-working local entrepreneurs, community leaders, and hopeful families. A thick, bright red ribbon was stretched across the front entrance. I walked to the center of the walkway where my mother was waiting for me. She looked absolutely radiant in a warm, tailored autumn coat. I reached out and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. I looked up at the polished silver letters mounted proudly above the double glass doors. It read, Ruth's Foundation. I had taken the millions of dollars Vanguard recovered from the Kensington liquidation and redirected a massive portion of it right back into the community. We built a state-of-the-art community center specifically designed to provide grants, mentorship, and free legal resources to underprivileged women trying to start their own small businesses. It was a sanctuary for women who had the drive and the talent, but lacked the financial backing that the elite took for granted. A local city official handed me a pair of oversized ceremonial scissors, but I did not take them. Instead, I handed them directly to my mother. She had sacrificed her entire life to give me the tools I needed to succeed. This moment belonged entirely to her. Ruth smiled, tears of pure joy shining in her eyes, and sliced cleanly through the red ribbon. The crowd erupted into genuine, deafening applause. I looked at the happy, hopeful faces surrounding us, and a profound sense of peace washed over me. The Kensingtons thought they could use my background against me. They thought growing up without a trust fund made me an easy target, but they fundamentally misunderstood the power of a woman who knows exactly what she is worth. Walking away from toxic people is never easy. It takes an immense amount of courage to draw a hard boundary and refuse to let anyone diminish your value. Whether it is a manipulative partner, a toxic family dynamic, or a workplace that refuses to respect you, you have the absolute right to protect your peace. You do not have to accept the scraps they throw at you. You do not have to shrink yourself to fit into their deeply flawed narratives. The ultimate revenge against people who try to destroy you is not just exposing their lies. It is walking away, rebuilding your life on your own terms, and succeeding beyond their wildest comprehension. Living incredibly well is the sharpest blade you can wield. You have the power to rewrite your own story just like I did. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic relationship, a manipulative family, or a situation that demanded you compromise your self-worth, I want to hear about it. Drop your story in the comments below. Tell me how you drew your boundaries and reclaimed your power. Let us build a community of strength, because your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today to finally walk out the door.